Well, it's not normally worth showing you the underside of a 20-year-old small car, but the Audi A2 is special. Hello guys and welcome back to the volkswizard channel. Today's video is about a car that you could say is the automotive equivalent of Concorde. Concorde pushed the boundaries for commercial aviation in the 60s and 70s with its ability to go supersonic, but by the noughties it proved just too expensive to remain in service, and we've not had a supersonic commercial airliner ever since. This car pushed the boundaries for what you could expect technologically in the small car class, but because it cost so much to produce, it wasn't very competitive, and by the mid-noughties it was canned. It is of course the all aluminium Audi A2. Today I'm going to tell you everything you need to know about this car and why I saved this particular example from the scrapyard. But before we do that, let me give you some statistics on the Audi A2. Okay, the first time the public saw anything like the Audi A2 was back in 1997. You may remember that was the year Tony Blair came to power as the Prime Minister here in the UK. Audi launched the A2 concept at the Frankfurt Motor Show in 97, and just 2 years later a very similar car went on sale called the Audi A2. Now, a couple of years earlier, Mercedes had launched the A-Class, and that was the A2's biggest rival, but that had a tricky start to life when a Swedish magazine put it on its roof when performing the now infamous elk test, something Swedish drivers apparently have to do quite regularly to avoid elks on their roads. Even with that bad start to life, it outsold the Audi A2 by a factor of 1 to 6. So in the 7 years the A-Class was on sale, it sold over 1 million units. The A2 was on sale for 6 years and sold just 176,000. The biggest problem was the price. It was built at Audi's Neckarsulm plant in Germany, where labour is expensive. It was made out of aluminium. We'll talk about that more later, but it had an aluminium space frame. Audi had pioneered that with the A8 that had been launched in about 94, but that car had much bigger profit margins. So to be able to give that to a small car like this, which was primarily a price-led purchase by consumers, and make a profit was difficult. The car was priced at the end of the run, a 1.6 FSI like this one was just under £15,000. To put that into perspective, it's very hard to get prices from over 15 years ago, but one thing I'm pretty sure of is that in 2007, a Golf 1.6 match was 15,165. That was a Mark V Golf, so a bigger class of car, and it was only a little bit more expensive. Even inflation would have allowed for that. There were petrol and diesel engines available. The petrol range started off with a 1.4 16-valve engine that produced 75 horsepower. We'd seen that before in the Lupo and the Polo. It was nothing special. Much more interesting was the engine in this car, the 1.6 FSI. That produced 110 horsepower. And bear in mind, it weighed under a ton. It gave it a better power-to-weight ratio than the Mark IV Golf GTI 20-valve, which had 125 horsepower. There were 3-cylinder diesels as well, so the petrols were all 4-cylinder, diesels were 3. The main engines were the 1.4 TDI, that produced 75 and 90 horsepower. There was also, for Germany and maybe other left-hand drive markets, a 1.2 litre TDI that was a special eco version. It was designed to do over 100 kilometres and use less than 3 litres of fuel, which works out to about 94 miles per gallon, and it did that quite happily. A2s were super light because of their aluminium, therefore very, very efficient. They're on average about 900 kilograms, and even though they look quite bulky, they had, well, the 1.2 litre had the lowest aerodynamic drag of any production car back when it was launched 22 years ago, so that helped them be super efficient. But unfortunately, buyers didn't really care about that. A couple of years later you had the Mini, which was a very normal construction of steel, and it had really bad dated engines in it, but it looked cool and people liked that, and they didn't really care about technology, or they didn't really care too much about the emissions then, as government taxes on emissions weren't really that heavy back then, so the efficiency of the A2 was a bit ahead of its time. Right, let's have a look around the outside and the inside of the Audi A2 now. Now, time has sort of softened, I think, the looks of the Audi A2. You have to go back to 1999 and imagine what it looked like back then. We're used to high riding cars now. Almost every car is an SUV, but back then high cars were not that common. We had MPVs like the Renault Espace and other sort of people carriers like the Charan, but this was smaller, so it wasn't really a multi-purpose vehicle in the traditional sense. You couldn't carry more people. You actually pay extra to have a 5-seater rear seat. Only 4-seaters were standard. So it was a bit Strange. And as for driving position, I sat behind a Skoda Karoq the other day and I was sitting higher than the driver. So yeah, it was a peculiar thing back then, but I think time has softened it. And if you told me today, if it had modern lights and maybe a more modern interior, that the bottom half of the car contained an electric battery, I wouldn't be completely surprised. And I'll show you why that would actually make perfect sense when we have a look at the inside. But first, we're going to take a look at the most distinctive feature of the Audi A2, and that's the fact that you don't open the bonnet to check the fluids. Now there is a conventional bonnet release, but that's where convention stops. So down here, pull that, and normally the bonnet would have popped up and you'd put your hand in and lift it up, but no, we have this flap. So in here we have the oil filler, we have the dipstick, which is a very, very long dipstick, as you can imagine. It's quite hard to get in when you're holding a camera. And we have the screen wash top up there, and that is it. No need to check coolant, they say, which is actually quite ironic on the 1.6 FSI, which we'll talk about later. You just undo those. I shall put the camera down, otherwise there will be a mishap. And you just slide it off like this. I shudder to think how many garages have put them on the floor and driven over them or trodden on them. I would imagine they would be quite expensive to replace. And there you have the engine. Now this car's got the 1.6 FSI, like I think I mentioned earlier, 110 horsepower. It's a 16 valve engine and it's got direct injection. So it was probably the engine of the range that was most in tune with the aluminium construction, the advanced aluminium construction, rather than say the old 1.4, even the quite noisy PD diesels. You see this sort of corroded engine cover, but then you look at the aluminium space frame and you see all that grey down there. It's all absolutely mint, even underneath the car where it's been exposed to salts, it's in there as well. And that is the chassis leg there. So that is really the unique selling point of the Audi A2, the fact that it doesn't really rust. We'll get it on the ramp later and have a look underneath it. I'll show you. It's up close down there. The wheels were 16-inch on this SE model. I think you could have as small as 14s on the Eco TDIs. 15s were common. 17s were popular on the Sport model and the Colour Storm, but they made the ride a bit too hard. Because Audi didn't want this car to tip over like the Merc, they actually gave it quite a firm ride, and which actually gives it quite sporty handling, which I'll demonstrate later. This car's got disc brakes on the back. Only the TDI 90 and the 1.6 FSI get those, and it's kind of a nice touch to have that. Of course, we have aluminium brake calipers on there. At the back, you've got this sort of spoiler tacked onto the glass tailgate. There's no rear wiper. They said you didn't need it because of aerodynamics. It's not really true. And it's quite plain at the back. There's no exhaust pipes visible. This car's got retrofit parking sensors. But I like this car because it's basically a launch spec car. Even though it's 2003 model year, they hadn't changed them much by this point. Slightly afterwards, the marketeers got to them to try and sell them with limited editions and all that, but this was basically a launch spec car, and it's got the dark interior as well, which we'll have a look soon. There's an electronic release there for the boot, and the boot was actually 390 litres, which is bigger than a Golf. Even today I think that's bigger than a Golf 8 in this small car, which is incredible. It's probably to do with the depth. So if you take this carpet out, you've got all this, and even down here we've got a big battery and toolkit. I think you could spec a space saver that went in there, but without that it was a very big boot. The seats fold forward. This is a 4-seater version. It's actually a split down the middle, not 60-40, and you can take the back seats out as well to turn it into a little aluminium van should you wish, quite easily apparently. I've never done that, and I'm not in a rush to do it for you guys because quite often it's very hard to get them to clip on there, but you even had 2 clipping positions for the back seats there and all the way back, so they thought about that. Material quality was actually very good. You can see this plastic is nothing like scratchy at all. Manual windows in the back. There is a limit to what they could give you back in the 90s. Electric windows at the front on this SE. Climate control, which I think was optional. Concert CD player, and the sort of very normal 4-spoke Audi steering wheel. Typical of this era, the soft touch plastics do wear, particularly around the headlight switch and on the climate control, and there's a bit left on the stereo. The climate control's been repaired with like a kit of stickers that you put over the worn areas, and that works pretty well. 5-speed gearbox in all the models apart from the 1.2 TDI, which had a very interesting automatic. It also had start-stop in that 1.2 TDI, which wasn't available in the rest of the range. The seating position, as I said, is quite high, but it feels very natural. The seats aren't particularly noteworthy, but they're really good fabrics. I mean, look at that, 20 years old and there's barely any wear on there. Likewise, steering wheel. So it's kind of very traditional in here, but you've got weird little things like this handle there. You've got these very hard to clean quarter light windows in the front, which sort of became norm on the Leon and other cars since. Even the Mark 7 Golf has got them. And you've got these lines in the roof. There was an open air sunroof, which was a glass panel as well, but that proved very problematic. So in here, yeah, it looks normal, but maybe you're wondering what's sort of between there and there. Well, let's have a look. So this is why I think it would work as an electric car. So we've got an overmat here, very good quality carpets, much better than a modern A3. And then look at that, we've got this hidden panel with 3 clips. And there we have electronics. So actually the floor is all the way down there. So it's exactly how I'd imagine an electric vehicle to be constructed now, with this sort of sandwich section there that houses all the batteries. But no, it was advanced in its external appearance, but relatively conventional in the way it was propelled. Apparently a company in Germany did convert one of these to electric in 2010, and they drove, I think it had a range of like 360 miles. They drove a long way and they still had a lot of range left. I know people modify classic cars to be electric, but if anyone's got one of these electric, I would love to drive it. Right, before we go for a drive though in this 1.6 FSI, we'll get it on the ramp in the workshop and have a good look at that very special Audi aluminium space frame construction. Right, well, it's not normally worth showing you the underside of a 20-year-old small car, but the Audi A2 is special. Let me show you how special. This, from this angle, it doesn't look very special. We've got probably polo suspension here, so a torsion beam made of steel, which is as a result quite rusty, but magnetic. But up there, that's aluminium, which does not rust, as you can see, not magnetic. Look at that big piece there. It's not like a TT Mark II where there's bits of aluminium, it's all aluminium. That's the bottom of the space frame sandwich. Look at this piece here, where the jacking point is, nice solid bit there. We've got steel here for this sort of subframe, and there's an inner subframe that's aluminium there. Interestingly, unlike TT, the arms are steel, but they don't need to be strong because it's not a very heavy car. You do need to watch these though, because they are quite delicate, and 20 years of corrosion can just make them crumble and fail, which is apparently not a very nice experience. So yeah, it's really just the bolt-on bits that corrode, and they're sort of easily replaced. This body will go on forever. I've always wondered how much it would be worth scrap, because a normal car this size at the moment is worth probably about £300. Being aluminium, it's probably got to be over 500 quid, and you can buy a whole A2 for 500 quid and get your money back, or even make a profit scrapping it, which would be a real shame. It's a real shame because for a 20-year-old car, it does drive really well, as I'll show you right now. Okay guys, well, welcome to the inside of my own personal Audi A2 1.6 FSI SE. I've had this car for about 10 months now. It came in part exchange against an Up GTI, and any sensible dealer would have just scrapped it, taken the aluminium premium and be done with it. But no, I had to get it running properly, and that's what I've done. Although I am selling the car, it's actually sold now, and this is the last drive before it goes, but I've enjoyed the time with it. Although for the 10 months I've had it, it's been off the road for most of that time being fixed, just because I've done it sort of outside hours. I've probably done about 1,000 miles in it in total, and now it drives very well. I can see the appeal. I'd had an A2 1.4 TDI before. It's a great car, and it had been remapped by Stealth, but that didn't make it any more refined, and that thrummy 3-cylinder diesel in an aluminium shell just was a bit too much of a cacophony for me. It used to give me a headache. So I'd been recommended the 1.6 FSI on the condition that, you know, you might have to do some work. When I got it originally, the engine management light was on because the intake manifold flap had broken. I'd fixed that. I've renewed pretty much the whole cooling system, water pump, thermostat housing, the famous death pipe, called that because when it does fail, most of these cars get written off. Yeah, I've pushed through all that, and then when I got it running, it was a bit flat at low revs, and it would sort of pick up at about 2.5. But actually, the more miles I've done in it with super unleaded in it, the better it's got to drive. Even when they were new, I think they needed really super unleaded, but now we've gone to E10 on the normal unleaded. You have no choice but to run these on super, and they do run better. I feel the electronics have learned now. We're running good fuel in this car, and it is a lot more responsive. I mean, we're in 5th gear now, and it's got some... No, we really are in 5th gear now. It's got some urge. And then, okay, it's a 16 valve engine, so it's not as responsive like a turbo would be from almost tick over upwards. It does need revving, but it's actually adequately responsive now. Before, it felt almost dangerous. I just realised there's quite a lot of obstruction with the A pillar. That car on the roundabout was not visible, actually, so that's a little trait of the A2 that you do need to be careful of. You need to sort of look around them. So we're in 4th. Let's see, well, it's a 50 mile an hour road now, so let's just drop down to 40. Loads of classic buses on the road today because we've got this really cool transport museum down the road in Withell, worth a visit if you're in the area. On special days they do these drives in these old buses like that one, which is one I would have been on when I was a kid many years ago. Okay, I think we're below 40 now, so RPM's about 1800, foot to the floor in 5th. Yeah, 50, so it's got some guts, but when you rev it, it's a lot more responsive. It's quite refined as well. The only problem with these cars, the gear ratios are quite short. So at 50 we're doing 2,200 RPM, which isn't great, and that's because it's not a turbocharged car. It hasn't got loads and loads of torque. But when you get them on the motorway, they're in their element. And I bought this car because the FSI system made this car more economical than the 1.4, but a lot more powerful. The 0 to 60 of the 1.4 is something like 12.6 seconds. In this one, it's 9.7, and yet it's better on fuel. So that really sort of sparked the interest in this car, the fact that it was just such a clever engine. Okay, we're on some country roads now. We're actually going to go onto the road that I've driven a lot in up GTIs. It's a nice small car, so it does suit this road. Anything as big as a Golf, it's a little bit too narrow. But you know, it's got some guts. And it's so light, it's under a ton. Even this 1.6 FSI is under a ton. And that means the power to weight ratio is somewhere in between the Mark IV Golf 1.8 20 valve with 125 horsepower and the 150. And lightness makes everything better, the handling as well. So, and it's quite a comfortable car on these 16s. We have some horses. On these 16-inch wheels, it's not crashy at all. There are lots of reports when you have the sport suspension and the 17-inch wheels that really isn't suited to UK roads, but this is perfectly fine. It's a great balance. I mean, we've just got rudimentary torsion beam at the back, but because it's so light, we don't need the complexity of the multi-link to get the car riding well and handling well, as I will now show you. So, I mean, that's third gear, that's 40, 45, and now 4,000. It does shift. So we're doing 60 now. Steering's a little bit vague, but it's okay. I won't change gear because there's just so little mass to control. If you like driving ups, you'll kind of know how driving a light car like this feels. It's a lot better in the corners than the 1.0 TSI 90 up. That does roll a lot. And actually the contemporary Polo was pretty terrible. So somehow they managed to make this just feel so much nicer to drive. I think Autocar called it a riot to drive, which is maybe a bit excessive, but I've got to go back 20-something years and think about how cars drove then, particularly Mark IV Golfs, and it's way better. And we've got a stiffer shell as well, which no doubt helps. Mark IV Golfs were quite flexy. And on these kind of roads, the short gears don't really matter. In fact, they really kind of help it. So as long as you're off the motorway, it's all right. It makes a decent noise as well. I'm sure the engine is related in some way to that of the Lupo GTI, but it's obviously a little bit down on power. That's a 125, this is 110. 4,000, just like a Mark II. We got the ASR traction control on there, so there's enough torque to upset the tyres even on a dry road like this. And this car's done 70,000 miles, it's 20 years old, it's on its original suspension, so with a fresh set of dampers I think it would be even better. So guys, there we have the Audi A2 1.6 FSI, a car that cost Audi something like £4,000 per unit. They lost money on every single one. But they might have lost money, but I think they gained a lot of respect, maybe not so much from owners but other manufacturers, that they could engineer a car like this that was so far advanced. It might have been a bit more expensive than its competition, but it was a lot more advanced. And it was a time in the Volkswagen Group when accountants didn't rule, and they would take gambles, probably because of Ferdinand Piech, who was the boss at the time, who was really, really intense on pushing the boundaries. Anyway guys, thank you as ever for watching this volkswizard video. If you have enjoyed it, give it a thumbs up. Please do comment as well, I do try and read them all, and please do share it, and please subscribe. We're so close to 40,000. Let's get there very, very soon. That will mean a lot to the channel. I'll see you for the next video very soon.